Hello everyone, welcome back to Trek-A-Day and another Trek Chat. A few things to talk about in this one. First off, before we get into our handful of TNG rewatch episodes here, Strange New Worlds, and something I've been thinking about as we are nearing the end of Season 3. It seems to be, and this is part of the frustration with the third season that I've been having, developing kind of backwards as a series. And what I mean by that is a lot of TV shows, I would actually venture to say the majority of TV shows, spend much of their first season really trying to find themselves, trying to define what the show is exactly going to be. The characters are just kind of getting into their roles, and as you get into later seasons, you have a lot more background for those characters. The actors have had really a lot of time to define what their performance is going to be. There's just so much that is worked through in that first season of a lot of shows that even when a show has a great first season, it still has a lot of those kind of awkward elements. There are, of course, exceptions, very rare exceptions, and oddly enough, Star Trek, the original series, is one of those exceptions with its stellar first season. But even something like The Next Generation, there's a lot of good in that first season, but it also really stumbled through many episodes in trying to define what being a new Star Trek series was going to actually be like. Even mega hit comedies like Seinfeld, that first season is a little awkward, and they changed some things up, got rid of a character, made Elaine more prominent, changed a few things about some of even the location of the diner, just reworking some things. And it could be something as simple as trying to define an important element of a character and kind of figuring it out as you go through that first season. Hercules and Hercules' Legendary Journeys, the original movies, and the first season, the level of his strength would vary as they were trying to kind of find the balance to where obviously he was much stronger than the average man, but do you make him so strong that nothing else seems like an actual threat, and characters like Aeolus become kind of useless because the difference is so incredible, but you also don't want to have it to where he's just kind of an extra strong guy, like a powerlifter or something like that. You want it to be more extreme, so kind of struggle to find that balance a little bit. So that is usually the case. It's very, very common. In Strange New Worlds, I think right out of the gate, it felt very much like a show that was confident in what it was. That first season, it was imperfect. There were some episodes I didn't quite like, but overall I thought it was a very solid season, especially for a first season, and it felt at the time like, to use a common phrase, a breath of fresh air, because it felt like something that was going to be a very, for the most part, traditional Star Trek show. It felt like, okay, this was a really good start, and we can build from there and get better and better each season. And instead, the opposite has happened, where it feels less assured of what it is as a show as it moves along. In season 2, there's still a lot of good, there was still some bad. It started, I feel like, to veer off and become more experimental. Kiva has talked about wanting to explore different genres with each episode, and that idea, I think, can work. I don't think it has, but it hasn't been all bad in that season. It just felt a little more mixed. It felt like it was a show that wasn't quite as confident in its concept. And then season 3 felt even more so, and it felt like even when something sort of worked, the overall quality of the writing felt even more lost and more muddled. So it feels like it's just kind of doing the opposite, to where that level of trying to figure out what this show is going to be, and wild shifts and tones and things of season 3 feels more like it should have been that the first season trying to figure itself out, and then season 2 gets a little more confident, still a little bit trying to find its way, and then season 1 is more like a third season where it's okay, we've determined what this show is going to be, and here's what we're getting. So it's one of the frustrations I've had with it, is it feels to be kind of going backwards. Getting into our handful of TNG episodes for this Trek Chat. If you're new to these, just been very quickly go through a couple episodes, just some minor thoughts of a rewatch of TNG that I've been doing with my wife, just a couple of episodes every few weeks or whatever here and there. We're up to Data Lore, which is one of my favorites from the first season, and one of the go-to ones that I'll point to as the first season of TNG being underrated. I've talked more about in the past, and will again in the future in a video, talk about the first season of TNG, and it does have huge problems, and we'll get into it here, but I do think that it is overall an underrated season because of those few examples where things really did work, and I think Datalore is one of those. I think that it's one that in watching the reruns in the 90s, watching Star Trek, watching new episodes throughout the 90s, TNG was also, at least on one of the channels that I had, in reruns every weekday throughout the 90s. And this is one of those that, if it weren't for Riker missing his beard and the existence of Tasha, I would forget it was a season 1 episode. And it's great at this early stage to have a chance to explore Data's origins and explore and get a greater understanding of such a fascinating new character, and having that difference in dynamic of Lore, who's also just a great character, and seeing Brent Spiner get a chance to really show his acting chops very, very early on in the season, as he was still kind of at that point really defining his performance of what Data was going to be, and I think even the writing was getting there. Here I think it's where it was a bit of a turning point, where it feels much more defined, feels like it really kind of found itself a bit more, and he also got a chance to play off of that with Lore and get a different perspective, and just overall I think it's a pretty fantastic episode. And then we get into Angel 1, which is sort of a return to the majority of Season 1, where I think we have a lot of interesting pieces to a potentially good story that just don't quite work. Things like the sexual element, both when it's played for humor and when it's intended to be a more sensual scene, just comes across as awkward and silly. And while a lot of the ideas presented in this episode have potential, it's something that I actually could see a heavily reworked version of this episode playing in a later season of TNG kind of working out, because there's a lot of interesting ideas of examining the differences in perception of the roles of men and women in society, really reflecting, especially in this point in the 80s, it was becoming much more common to not have a parent at home, the rise of latchkey kids, and seeing some of those dynamics change. That was a time when you had the big shoulder pad kind of power suits for businesswomen, and a lot of ideas that could have been explored in an interesting way, and here just they weren't at all. It feels more like a leftover rough draft of a TOS episode. It just is one of those season 1 episodes that feels like it wasn't quite there, but at least there's some ideas that, God, I wish it had been written better, because it could have said something interesting, but it really didn't. One thing I did like was, I think, Dr. Crusher and the bits that she was in this episode really stood out. But overall, it was just sort of a not so great episode that was very emblematic of the issues that Season 1 had. And then the last thing for today, just wanted to get into a little bit of a discussion based on the very few negative comments within that Star Trek Strange New Worlds review, The 4.5 Vulcans. They really came in only 3 forms. One that I will discuss in a later episode because there's a lot I really want to get into. The other one is just very simple. You're thinking too much. Just watch the episode without thinking, and it's just sort of a silly fun time. And I feel like that is just funny because it was a perfect example of something I discussed in that video, of something that might appeal to someone who kind of watches it like a Marvel movie, just absorbing content and just not thinking about it, that maybe this would appeal to you. And then there was a comment or two showing that's exactly the audience that it appealed to. But the other one was talking about, in reference, I think, largely to the idea of the serum, and part of why part of that just didn't work for me, equating Star Trek's technology to the magic of things like Harry Potter or Alice in Wonderland, and how that makes it then, kind of renders it senseless to argue about any conflict of validity with any idea of anything technology related in Star Trek. It's just fictional magic, it's not worth thinking about at all. And that's kind of the common thread within any of the negative comments, was it's fine if you don't think about it at all. And I can't wrap my head around watching Star Trek and not using your brain. It's just bizarre to me. So I'm really baffled in that case by the inability to see the difference between something like magic in Harry Potter and fictional technologies in something like Star Trek, and how that perspective, I feel, really belittles Star Trek when it's really good and when it's thoughtful, and fails to understand a part of what makes it a special show. Star Trek is by no means hard sci-fi, not at all. That I think is more of a brand of science fiction that can feel somewhat limited by the rigid restrictions of adhering only to currently provable science. I think that's an element of a lot of that type of science fiction, to where it is truly 100% this needs to be grounded in science that we can prove. There's nothing that is speculative or theorized, not in the scientific sense of a scientific theory, but theorizing, nothing that is a maybe. It has to be something that is a so. But that doesn't mean that it is the same thing as wand-waving magic. Star Trek exists in a realm where its science is driven by storytelling first and foremost, which is part of what makes us want to come back to those characters and these worlds, with the technological, otherwise scientific element being a necessary secondary part of the story. A lot of scripts are sometimes written with a rough draft of the story and a lot of spaces where they're not quite certain how this idea is going to work, as just sort of, science, or technobabble, whatever, and then going to the science advisor and seeing how this could work. And sometimes if it's just not going to work, it ends up in a huge rewrite of a script. It's a part of the process. But even when story comes first, its better stories do ask how those aspects of the tale can be grounded in as much reality as possible, without losing that wonderment of a more speculative and creative view of the universe. Star Trek, when it's great, I feel creates something that we might be currently unable to prove with real-world science, but might be possible. That is one of the important elements, is that it might be possible. It's not magic. It says, okay, we can't actually do this yet, but if we could, what existing real-world principles would allow that to work? Many of Star Trek's ideas do actually come from some actual real-world questions within the scientific community, asking and theorizing about possible futures for humanity, looking into, okay, what are some questions that people are asking in these spaces? What are ideas that we're exploring for the first time, and then showing them in Star Trek and trying to give them some grounding to say, hey, these things that we're thinking about for the first time in the 60s, 80s, 90s, or now something that exists 400 years later. Science fiction often finds itself dealing with concepts or technologies which are beyond our current capabilities, but good science fiction sets up its own rules for its world to make those things make logical sense. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions that can be pointed to. Nothing which has been telling countless stories across hundreds of episodes and books and movies and comics, video games, and thousands of stories, really. Nothing that's been doing that for 60 years could hope to be anywhere near perfect. And beings such as Q and several other examples do exist, whose abilities are so beyond even Starfleet's understanding that their actions can, in the moment, seem like magic. I think those are necessary encounters to be a reminder to the audience, to the fan, that there is always something more to learn. There will always be something beyond our understanding. But instead of viewing it as magic and fearing it, we are urged to instead be curious, not to view it as magic, but rather than to view those things as yet another example of an unexplored frontier of knowledge. And this is one part of why Star Trek has such a powerful impact on both the imagination and the scientific curiosity of generations of young minds. It gives the characters and the messages that its stories advocate a world that you could see yourself in, and something you can strive towards and hope that humanity will someday reach. Whether we're talking about an actual device or a societal change, it excites the viewer and dares them to dream and say, I want to make that happen someday. It helps give some weight to the drama, some excitement to the adventure, and when used effectively, it can elevate the humor. Humor has always been a very important part of Star Trek because that's an important part of everyday life, but it has to, again, make sense within the rules of the world that's been created. Even really good fantasy, things that couldn't possibly exist and obviously have zero scientific grounding, even really good fantasy sets up some rules for the magic of its world. Science fiction like Star Trek is something different, though. You can't watch Harry Potter or Doctor Who and say, I want to envision a future where what I'm seeing on screen is reflected in reality someday. Logic, consistency, and creativity combine to add a greater significance beyond it's just for fun, even when it is fun. There's a reason Star Trek has extraordinary, complex technical manuals, and why there's always been a fascination amongst its fans with learning how things work within Star Trek. This thing does this is only half the fun. The how does this thing do that is the other half. Like its stories, the technology in Star Trek invites the viewer to think about what they are watching, not just to sit and absorb content for 40 minutes and move on. And that's just my general thoughts on the role that science and technology play in Star Trek. Again, it's not hard sci-fi, but it's also not just whimsical fantasy with no thought into how things work. It is in this middle ground that I think is beautiful because it gives room for stories to breathe and real avenues for dreaming within a logical sense, a reasonable sense about the future and about the possibilities. And I think that is one part of why Star Trek continues to endure.